But without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to invite Deputy Susie Pinel.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and thank you for inviting me today. I've been asked to speak to you in my role as Minister for Treasury and Resources, to which I was appointed in June 2018, following 3 years as Minister for Social Security. However, I could just as easily be talking to you as a businesswoman. As some of you will know, I have been involved with the art restoration and conservation business for 35 years. I've worked on many beautiful and priceless collections in the UK and Jersey, including the Royal Collection of portrait miniatures, 3,500 of them housed at Windsor Castle. I was awarded a Royal Warrant for this work in 2001 by Her Majesty the Queen. In 2011, I was persuaded to be part of a business team established to encourage more women into politics. So impressive were my powers of persuasion that I found myself walking the streets and knocking on doors in the October election. The result, I topped the polls as Deputy for St Clement, and instead of spending my days with its exquisite, irreplaceable objects that don't answer back, I now work with politicians. Art gives me a valuable background and balance in a life which is otherwise consumed by the pressures of politics and ministerial decision-making. My experience of running my small business has also given me an appreciation of the pressures that businesses in our island face, as well as how government can help or hinder businesses in their quest for success. I appreciate the conflict that both businesses and government constantly have to grapple with in our island, and as well as how government can help or not. For few businesses that have succeeded in the long term have done so by living from day to day. We all know the figures, that many businesses fail and many in their first year. Poor business planning, poor research into product, market and customers, lack of funding, poor structure, poor leadership, poor decision making are all reasons why businesses fail. Those businesses that succeed, by contrast, have generally thoroughly researched their sector. They've established a sound business plan backed by sufficient funding to see them through lean times. Government is no different, except we don't have the freedom to fail. We have to start, move on, and go somewhere else. We simply have to succeed. We don't have the options of moving somewhere else. The alternative is unthinkable, although some countries have tried at catastrophic cost to their citizens. It is not a path to be recommended. So the principles of good governance are as important for a good government as they are for good business. As a Minister for Social Security in the previous government, I was responsible for bringing in almost all of the discrimination laws, including race, age, gender, disability, and family rights, many of which were overdue by some 40 years or more and part of good social governance. As Minister for Treasury and Resources, basically the island's Chancellor, it's my job to protect the bank balance and financial security of the island. I'm responsible for ensuring that we have the revenue streams to fund our operation, that we don't spend more than we earn, and that we don't price ourselves out of the global marketplace through unsustainable taxes. I have to ensure that we follow all the rules of financial best practice, both as government and as Ireland's biggest business. Government finances are incredibly complex, and the decisions I'm required to make, often eye-wateringly sums of money are involved. Of course, like an FD, I don't make this decision on my own. There is a team of skilled and experienced individuals with me who help to advise and support, doing a great job every day in managing our island's finances. At this point, I would like to acknowledge the enormous expertise and outstanding contribution to the island given by Colin Powell. The extraordinary respect that all had for him means that I'm sure many of you will miss him hugely. Ultimately, though, advisers advise and ministers decide. Thus, the ministerial decisions rest with me, so I also have to make my own judgments. That's where I apply three very important principles which give me guidance in how to deal with all the issues I face. The ABC, the affordability, balance and common sense. Some of you will have heard me talk about these principles because they were in my election literature and also in my first budget speech and budget report last year. So I won't labour this point. But I will say that for a Treasury Minister, I must always consider what we can afford and sustain as a government and as an island. This is particularly relevant to trying to make sure there is an understanding of the difference between recurring costs and one-off expenditure. This means not making spending decisions for which we haven't got some certainty around funding. I know only too well financial difficulties that arise when you don't balance your income with your expenditure. As Minister for Social Security, a key part of my role was to protect the state's old age pension fund from being leveraged, as some called it, and the health insurance fund from being raided without a sustainable plan, both of which would have been short-term political expedients with significant long-term consequences. The last government was committed to a level of public spending and new streams of additional revenue to pay for them. For example, the commercial waste charges and the health levy. But these new revenue streams were voted out by this Assembly, partly as a result of a campaign by this chamber, leaving the government's finances out of kilter from the start. This left a legacy for the current government, which will get worse as we face a financial deficit of £30 to £40 million from next year. As Minister for Treasury and Resources, I have a responsibility to ensure we're balancing our income and our expenditure while protecting both our social security and strategic reserve funds. As you will have seen in our recently published annual reports and accounts, last year our expenditure exceeded income by £75 million. Whilst this was mainly due to a downturn in investment performance and the write-off costs of the hospital, clearly there is work to be done in achieving a balance. We've been very fortunate in recent years that our investment performance has been strong and income tax has exceeded forecasts. But these windfalls are not guaranteed and are susceptible to volatility in the economic cycle and changes to global markets, both of which are outside our control. We need to operate more efficiently and at lower cost. The Chief Executive is actively searching out those activities that can be improved and, more affordably, to deliver £30 million worth of sustainable efficiencies in the public sector. Revenue Jersey, the new name for the tax office, have stepped up our tax compliance activity, and last year we collected an additional £8 million by vigorously pursuing unpaid tax that is owed. We are currently compiling several strategies, the government plan, to direct us for the next 4 years. Unlike the medium-term financial plan, it will be far more flexible, with an annual rolling financial plan as opposed to the rigidity with set expenditure for 4 years in the MTFP. This, as you will be aware, has resulted in many of the current problems, not least the industrial disputes. These won't be easy discussions, but we absolutely must have the courage to make difficult decisions. A new policy group has been formed, apparently which I chair, to investigate, that's what it says here, to investigate new and different ways of raising revenue. It is simply untenable to expect a government to freeze its streams of income when it is faced with significant rising costs, such as in health, social care, education. I could continue, but it would be a very long list. When businesses face rising costs, you have exhausted cost-saving measures. You carefully consider raising prices. You do so with research and judgment and consideration for your market competitiveness. In Jersey, it seems as if taxes and charges are sacred cows which should never be touched. If the government has delivered substantial efficiencies and it still can't afford to pay for the services the island requires, then the government will need an honest conversation with the island about how and where it will raise more money, or it will have to cut some services. Short-term expediency versus long-term sustainability. As I said in my budget speech, something has to give. Not a message which many will be delighted, but we may have no alternative. So, do we need to raise taxes? And if so, which taxes? The short answer is potentially yes. We currently have some of the lowest rates of income tax, GST, and property rates in Europe, and our social security contributions are half of those in the UK, yet we still complain about the perceived burden of taxation. I'm convinced that if islanders want to continue to enjoy high-quality services, the government will, as part of a balanced strategy, also need to consider appropriate revenue raising and cost recovery measures for the future. But not until we have demonstrated that efficiencies are delivered and enduring. Nobody wants to see a permanent reduction in nursing, in policing, in fire and ambulance, in schools, in roads and sea defences, or in environmental protection. Quite the opposite. We, as islanders, will have to be prepared to pay more into the system if we want to maintain these services. This applies to businesses too. The majority of businesses benefit from our 0-10 corporate tax regime and low property rates. Yet, many balk at the prospect of the government recovering the cost of dealing with commercial waste, something that they would pay for without question in almost all other countries. We want businesses to pay a fair and proportionate contribution to public services. No one should avoid paying the tax for which they are liable. These issues include GST, property rates and other charges, and will be considered as part of the forthcoming government plan. I'll refer later to the need to review personal income tax. On May the 21st next week, we should be debating the new Revenue Administration Law. This new law provides a framework for Jersey's tax administration system, spanning income tax, GST and other tax legislation. It deals with the administration of the tax system, not with rates or levels of taxation due by businesses or citizens. I emphasise that because in the last debate, when this was brought before the Assembly, it went completely off tandem by somebody thinking the new women's tax situation was involved in this. The Revenue Administration Law will provide an effective and consistent approach to the administration of all taxes and in due course encompass social security contributions. It will make the rules on tax compliance clearer and the consequences of non-compliance much more transparent for everyone, making the system fairer for those who pay on time. This new law will support Revenue Jersey's new online filing system and give the government greater powers to recoup unpaid taxes. This in turn will benefit our future income streams, which we will need, for example, to achieve our target of becoming carbon neutral by 2030. It will ensure a level playing field for islanders and businesses. Under my watch, the government will be scrupulous in only spending what we must, in securing best value for money, and always asking the question, do we need to do this? That is my commitment to you, as the one who signs the cheque for the government. But I ask for a commitment from you too, not just to join us in a responsible debate about long-term public finances, but also to think more about long-term social progress and the government's financial sustainability. Businesses have a crucial role to play in developing our society as employers of people. The most successful businesses are those that generally value and support their staff. Business long-term profitability and sustainability is based on, and not an alternative to, investing in your people. A happy and engaged workforce is a loyal and productive workforce with lower staff turnover and more discretionary effort. With this in mind, I ask you to move beyond the, arguably, short-term thinking that has led some to oppose the proposed new family-friendly employment law. Instead, consider the long-term benefits to your businesses of looking after your employees. 86% of women in Jersey are in employment, and yet we have nothing in our law to protect the rights of breastfeeding mothers returning to work. The first few weeks and months of a child's life are crucial for parental bonding. Yet, in the 2016 Jersey Lifestyle and Opinion Survey, it was revealed that around 2/3 of new fathers had not taken any paternity leave. In terms of other changes that may affect businesses, we need to consider the statutory introduction of workplace pensions. I have mentioned this at Chamber before. We ask Chamber to engage actively in these issues and hopefully become champions, not opponents of these changes. In my view, many of these changes are overdue and make common sense. Something else I'm determined to change is our archaic personal income tax system. This has been the subject of repeated criticism and scrutiny, perhaps unsurprising, since the fundamental building blocks are largely unchanged since it was introduced in Jersey in 1928. In the 90 years that have elapsed since then, our society has changed beyond all recognition, whilst our personal income tax system has stayed rooted in the past. I'm committed to securing the reform we need and that islanders want, especially in regard to the taxation of married women. Not just because I'm a woman myself, but because it is ridiculously outdated and unfair for a woman to be a chattel of their husband, and he's here, in the current tax law. Earlier this year, we launched a public consultation to ensure we're capturing public opinion. I'm now awaiting the outcome of this consultation and aim to bring forward recommended changes as part of the 2020 government plan. A further necessary reform is updating the public finances law. Again, this is not a law that will change tax levels. I hope to introduce this new legislation in June, which will allow improved flexibility and the appropriate financial management and governance framework to control government finances. This framework will ensure that the States Assembly rightly retains overarching responsibility for making those important decisions on financial policy and the allocation of financial resources. It will provide a better balance between the Assembly retaining decision-making responsibilities and the flexibility for government to deal with change in a managed and timely manner. As with any organisation, circumstances and priorities can and do change quickly, and we need to be able to respond to them. I've talked about my experiences as a businesswoman and a politician with two ministerial roles. The most significant lesson I have learnt over the years is the need for long-term sustainability. That means long-term planning and looking at the bigger picture. As Treasury Minister, I receive constant requests for funding from both departments and external organisations. It's not just about affordability, it's also about the relative benefits of competing demands for funding. I must carefully weigh up each of these requests and assess the long-term benefit of each one, not in isolation, but in the round, compared to other requests. not all states members agree. For example, a recent state's decision to increase funding for the arts by £2.3 million per annum, i.e. recurring expenditure, should, in my view, have been considered against competing and to many equally deserving bids for funding, which currently come over to £100 million per year. We cannot afford to meet all these bids, and to consider bids in isolation makes no sense to me at all. I'm also involved in future decisions over funding over the next steps to progress the new hospital. Yet another board I wasn't aware I was on. I will challenge all bids for additional funding on so-called further exploratory work to seek to ensure that such bids come with clear outcomes, timelines and overall budgets. You probably might have questions on this later. To conclude, I'll relate a situation about what it's like to be on the other side of the fence from government as an applicant for funding. What happens when a government thinks only about the short term? I have been chairman of Brigadon Children's Residential Home for about 15 years. The charity is now called Brightly, but Brigadon Children's Home stays with its same name. In 2008, and I must qualify it's 2008, some 10 years ago, we were employing 17 staff and could accommodate 9 residential children at any one time. We were constantly living on the edge financially, so we applied to the government for an additional £40,000 to our government grant that would enable us to continue to function. The decision over this grant was passed from official to official, from minister to minister, over several years, forcing the closure of the home and the redundancy of 17 staff in 2008. The consequence of this was that 17 people lost their jobs, children were displaced, and some of them were sent to the UK at vast expense to Jersey. For want of a £40,000 increase in the annual grant, it ultimately cost the Government of Jersey £750,000 per annum. If proper process had been in place, and the government at the time had taken a long-term, rounded view, they could have saved the taxpayer hundreds of thousands of pounds, kept people in work, kept children in a place they felt safe, and kept children with particular needs in the island. This experience has strongly influenced my views as a minister, both as Social Security Minister and Treasury Minister, and it has forged my determination to ensure that the decisions I took to the long term are not just to the here and now. My mandates of ABC, affordability, balance and common sense continues to apply to the decisions I make in life, both personally and professionally. In a very uncertain global climate, I hope the ABC of Treasury will steer a steady course. Thank you for your attention.
Minister, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure, in fact I'd be amazed if there were not one or two questions to come from the floor, and if there are any. I know we do have some microphones somewhere, and I'm just looking out for them now. There's one there, and there's one over there. We have microphones. Does anyone have a question in particular they would like to ask for the Minister? Raise your hand now.
No, that's fine.
Excellent. There are a couple right at the back there, and we're going to get to you, and I know I've got one or two questions as well, which we'll be putting to you very shortly, Minister. It's been hit. So we'll have a question from the back first, and we're just finding who that is.
Good afternoon, Ronnie Stewart, Chamber of Digital. Thank you for your talk. I have a question on education. Do you have means to measure the financial impact of the current strikes in education on our businesses?
The short answer to that, in my capacity as a member, compulsory member of the State's Employment Board, is no, not that I'm aware of, because the strikes are still ongoing, the negotiation is still ongoing, whether it involves mediation, arbitration or any of the above, has not had a cost applied to it.
Thank you.
There is another question behind it. I think that's Gwen at the back. Am I right?
Hi, yes. It's another kind of educational really. You're talking about investing in people and sustainability. Your predecessor brought in the funding for university students. Is that something that's sustainable going forward? Because we were told there's only 3 years worth of money.
That's a very good question. Yes, it was brought in, and yes, it was well received. Whether it's sustainable in the long term is debatable, and that's part of the One Government plan, which is going to coincide with the budget to be lodged in July, to be debated in November, as to whether the funding for that is long-term sustainable.
We have got a chance for more questions. Tony has a question now. I think I need to get out.
You did a bit great with this. Hi, Susie. Great you're talking about where you have to make decisions. So I'm reminded of a speaker at a chamber lunch, possibly a couple of years ago now, and he was a senior economist in the Royal Bank of Scotland. And he was talking about the productivity challenges of Jersey in particular. He was talking about the risk of falling behind other jurisdictions, and he was talking about what countries in our situation have to do to resolve that. He said there are 2 areas that you really need to invest in. He talked about technology and modernisation, and he talked about education. How do we get back into focusing on those sort of areas rather than what we seem to get at the moment is money being spent, whether it's about GREA, free bus services, the climate change, the list goes on. How do we get back into a serious discussion about investing in a modern economy?
Thank you, Tony. That is what the thrust of my speech was all about, is to how we maintain expenditure with revenue and which are the priorities. And obviously the education, I think there's a 16 plus education survey that's just been, thanks Jeremy, launched.
Yeah. Consultation out how please engage.
Investing in the education of our young people, and I think the terminology is upskilling them to then take on from the consultants and interim people that we've got here at the moment, to get them to educate our people to continue from them. But going back to your question on education, it is a priority, of course it is, as our children, as is our environment, and it's a matter of balancing all those demands on the finances as to how you do it. And I think that's a question associated with the lady beforehand. And digital, of course, we have got the 5 gigabits from JT, which we should be using, or making more use of perhaps. And digital economy is absolutely paramount. We're taking lessons from Estonia, I think, at the moment.
Minister, family-friendly legislation, you mentioned it in your speech. You asked Chamber to support family-friendly legislation, which is coming up in June for debate. I don't think there's anyone in this room that wouldn't want the very best for our children, for newborn babies, for new mothers, new fathers, new adopted parents and more. However, knowing that the new legislation will give paternity rights to take up to a year off, legally, with 4 weeks' notice, in 3 blocks, over 2 years, puts a massive burden on businesses in this island. Knowing, as you know full well, that we have virtually zero unemployment and there is not a chance of having replacement staff coming in. Therefore, putting an extra burden on the majority of workers who will stay in their post. Knocking productivity, increasing mental health stress within the workplace, and not very family friendly on all those people who are left at work with 1 or 2 posts down. How do you balance the two at the same time as saying business please support family friendly?
I've always got on so well with Murray.
You're always such good colleagues.
I totally, having been involved in the early conception of this legislation, understand the difficulties and have spoken at length to Chamber about it beforehand. And if you have a business, we were discussing it earlier, of SME, a business of 5 employees or less, then the knock-on effect of this legislation is of concern. I couldn't disagree at all.
70% of our business is a small business.
I thought it was 80%.
80%, even worse.
However, we are so considerably behind in our maternity and paternity benefits and leave. There were none until not in law, before I started at Social Security. We have to play catch up, and the risk of repeating what I said before, I do think we've had it very good for a very long time. And I think now employers have to, as I think I said in my speech, have to start considering their employees more. But I do not underestimate the cost to small businesses that this might be. But equally, businesses will be refunded for the pay that they have to do for the 6 weeks. Government pays that. And there is a certain amount of leave that has to be announced quite a bit in advance of taking it. And I think that very few people, because of the demands on the majority of working people with their mortgage and children, will not be taken to 52 weeks. But it's new, so we have to wait and see.
It's 1 month's leave, and it's £197 that they'll get refunded. They won't get refunded any more than that, because that's the Social Security allowance, and that's only for the mother and not for the father, even though we're...
Well, it is the mother that gives birth.
I noticed that. But it's only £197 for 6 weeks, which is probably not what is being earned at that time. I'm just saying that for businesses there is massive stress, and you recognise that.
I do, absolutely.
Questions from the floor?
So I must add to that, because I would say something slightly controversial here. As a woman who's had children, I think it's going to discriminate against women, because I think if you're honest and we're in this room, when you have 2 candidates in front of you, one's a woman of childbearing age and one is not, I think I know which one I'm going to choose, because you're only going to have that cost upcoming.
I've lived with that all the way through my business career, so I completely understand what you're saying, and I don't think that will necessarily change. It's always been the same, that when you're going for an interview, the prospective employer will look at your childbearing age, whatever, and may not take you on. But of course the sex discrimination law is supposed to counter that, in as much as the employer, prospective, cannot ask that question.
We've got another line of Social Security, but just continuing with the family friendly. Of course, the new laws giving 6 months leave for parents came in only in September of 2018, which is not that long ago. Would it not be sensible, given that it's not even 9 months, as an optimum amount of months, since that came in, that we should perhaps give it 12 months, 18 months, in order to find out what damage, if it's doing any at all, to business before we introduce even more laws? Would that not be a sensible way forward?
I think, as I said in the previous answer, it was playing catch up, and yes, that may be a point, that it is too quick on the follow-up of the last law. However, we've got a lot of coverage to do in a short space of time in catching up on years and years of not having any legislation at all.
Okay, I'm sure there's more questions than we need yet. Oh, all over the place. Everywhere. Do you want questions to be first on the camera?
Thank you very much, Mr. So I'm actually quite glad to hear that you're playing catch up on some of these things. And as we look towards longer term sustainability for Jersey, much of the data now coming in globally, whether you look at the UN Sustainable Development Index, or the OECD Better Life Index, or the Gallup Thrive Index, and the list goes on and on, happier people are more productive people. closer knit communities are more productive. So I suspect that that conversation needs to be started or catalyzed here in Jersey, and maybe a broader discussion around what is the social contract. You mentioned that there may be a need to raise taxes, and certainly speaking as someone that comes originally from Canada, I'm quite amazed at the very high level of public services that people here in Jersey enjoy for the relatively low level of tax that is paid. So kudos to everyone for having that achievement. But as we face an aging population, and as we face the reality that young people are looking for different things in society, they are looking for fulfillment and purpose, they're looking for all of those things for engagement to the community, and if they're not here, they will leave. So, how do you propose to start that public conversation? And what kind of timing are you looking at for that, to set the groundwork for the future?
Thank you, Galina. I think there are about 60 questions in there. Trying to start and remember the health and well-being. You mentioned the sort of happiness of the people who helps the community. Health and well-being is one of the 5 strategic priorities in the CSP, the Common Strategic Plan, so that it is being addressed as we speak for when we produce the government plan. It's being recognised from the New Zealand and Wales, for instance, have a programme like this, so we're taking note of that. To keep the Jersey people in Jersey, we need to, I think that goes back to the education question that the lady asked after there, and Tony did as well. We need to upskill our youngsters so that they're there to, youngsters, to be able to take on those jobs. We just need to do it without them going away to university, which is great. I mean, I think that's part of a young person's education, if that's what they wish to do. But enticing them back is the difficult part of it. And the other question was? Timing. Well, it's, in theory, the government plan is pulling together all of these strands. We're doing it every other minute that I'm not standing here to try and put together this government plan, which encompasses the CSP, the Common Strategic Policies, how we do it, how we affect those policies, because it's quite broad-ranging what we're trying to do. And the difference being, which I don't think anybody's asked, I don't know if I explained, but the difference being from the medium-term financial plan, which was a 4-year rigid revenue and expenditure, or more expenditure, so we couldn't spend any money until the end of 2019. This is the part of the finance transformation programme, and it will be a 4-year, can't think of another word other than vision, which I hate, but anyway, a 4-year plan, but with the finance part of it as an annual rolling programme, which is what we didn't have before. Now that's all being put in place as we speak and will be lodged with the Assembly in July for debate in end of October, November. So that's the timing factor of it. And that will incorporate what we've loosely termed as the budget beforehand, which was always December, but the budget will be accompanying that government plan so that the public can understand what we want to do and how we're going to finance it.
Minister, only another 90 minutes of question. No, only another 10 minutes or so of questions. Martin.
Hi Susie, thanks very much for your informative speech. We enjoyed it. I've got 2 questions. The question will be around GST. How will you balance the future proposed GST taxes on core commodities such as food and beverage? Question 1.
Right, okay, that one first. Every time there's a debate about GST, it always incorporates the exceptions. I think it's sort of come down to the rather loosely termed rabbit food and Jaffa cakes, because nobody can quite put into what bracket food is. It is being looked at it hasn't got any further than that. It's being considered as something that we could increase because it is a tax that everybody pays. It doesn't hinder our competitiveness when it comes to an increase in income tax, for instance. It sticks to the rules of low, broad, fair and simple, which is what the tax tries to stand by. It will probably have to go up, but it will inevitably engender what the exceptions are going to be. And then food comes into the equation, but then what is food? So, and also by how much, that hasn't been worked out either.
Thank you for that. So that follows on then. So how will we maintain affordability for our community, especially post-Brexit, if we were to put additional GST charges onto the core commodities such as food, basics, bread, eggs, etc.? Thank you.
Again, yes, another board is the Brexit, I can't remember what it's called, Brexit contingency planning. And we've done a lot of work on that. And as far as the affordability, and I think I mentioned it earlier, that our GST is 5% compared to the 20% in the UK. The income tax is 20% compared to 40%. Our social security contributions are half of what they are in the UK.
Sorry, so just to note, the 20% on cost of GST on products in the UK. What do you understand is there's key core commodities that are outside of that, so basic bread, eggs, etc. aren't taxable?
Right, well that's what we talked about. Yes. What we said in answer to the first question is there will be the question of exemptions from the GST. Whatever we do, there will be the question, but then that's for a consultation and for the Assembly to debate.
Got a couple more questions, which I'm going to go very quickly. Just to summarise, GST will go up, and you think it's a reasonable point of view to extend family friendly by 12 months before bringing it in. That's what I've taken away so far.
I used to like them.
But Tony at the back, here's your question.
Yes, that's the medium-term financial plan, which we're still operating under. Do you think that a medium-term financial plan should not be set to operate well into the lifetime of a new government, given the constraints that the then gives regarding when elections take place, people know that whatever they're voting for is going to make no difference for at least a year. Whereas in most other jurisdictions, Guernsey, Isle of Man, UK, there's no such planning that will straddle an election or saddle an incoming government with a financial straitjacket for their predecessor.
Yeah, again, a very good question, but the idea being is it's a 4-year plan, so of course it will take over the government for the first year of the next election. But having been through 3 of those processes to date, the first year, it's impossible to try and adapt to and construct something completely new in as we're doing this time, moving from the medium-term financial plan to the government plan, which I just described to Galina as being sort of a financial rolling plan on an annual basis. You have to leave a new government with something that they can operate upon until such time as they get their feet under the desk, or whatever the phrase is, to start working with government. I mean, this is why it's taken us a year to translate from that restricted expenditure, which has caused the problems, into something that's more flexible. And perhaps a new government in 22 might want to change that, but we've got to give them with something to operate whilst they start working as a government before they address the financial issues.
Mr. One last question.
Yes, sir. I think what I'd say is I don't always agree with everything you say, but it's good to have a sort of iron lady in charge of the money in general, so I think it's a good speech.
Thank you, Kevin.
What I'd really like to ask you is, I mean, in Guernsey, they're well known for being tight-fisted, and they're able to run their public sector quite a lot cheaper than we can run ours. what can we learn from Guernsey and how can we share with Guernsey?
Controversial.
As a Jersey girl, do you really expect me to discuss Guernsey? I think looking at, as I mentioned before, the bigger picture, both islands could learn an awful lot from each other, actually, if they would try. And we have tried this with Guernsey on several occasions, the air registry being a notable one. And it doesn't always work. There's a different methodology of their operation and ours. But we do try, I think, it's certainly in a Brexit scenario, which is, again, a much broader horizon. We started off working with Guernsey very closely, and then suddenly their terminology changed, and without informing us, they went to the UK and changed part of the law, rules. So yes, we would like to work more closely. It would make sense to work more closely. We'd have bigger clout more closely, but there was a war, and I think the civil wars we haven't got over it.
Minister, thank you very much for answering the questions. You can answer this probably in a sentence. Yeah, retail tax. No, I won't mention retail tax. Let's talk GST on goods coming in from online. Are you going to seize the opportunity? Are you going to seize the opportunity to raise some taxes just by the people who refuse to buy things locally but buy things online by lowering the de minimis, which is very, very collectible and easy to do?
Somebody's answered over there. No, we talked about lowering the de minimis. At the moment, the de minimis collected on goods over £240 is £12, and that was largely because of a administration charge. But now it's so well organised by Jersey Post that actually it would not necessarily require that amount of payment.
So there's some money to be picked up there.
Well, there's also a question of whether we reduce it and make it balance out to £135, which is, we've worked out would do that, or we just wait because it depends on Europe and where we go with Customs Union as to whether it is just abolished completely, which is what the expectation is, the de minimis level, that is.
Do you think that retailers will last long enough for that?
Of course they will.
Excellent.
I have total faith in our retailers.
I'm sure they have total faith in you as well. Minister, thank you very much indeed, the Minister for Treasury and Resources, Dr. Susie Pinel.